Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. So today we are going to talk about the third, more general aspect of fashion in the 19th century before next week we start the 5-week set of discussions of specific styles. So today the general aspect is the connection between fashion and social etiquette. So not really the styles, not really the exciting novelties and fads and such things, but rather the question of the appropriateness of dress, which was more the question of etiquette than fashion as such. So this was one of the most important things really in 19th century attitudes towards clothing. The clothes had to be appropriate. They had to be appropriate to one's station in life, to the time of day, to the occasion, to the time of year, of course, but these were general considerations that affected everything about the clothes. The form of garments, the choice of materials, the colors, the decorations used, everything had to be really appropriate rather than only fashionable. This was a very important thing. It was as important as good manners. And if you know anything about the 19th century morality and values, good manners among the middle class, also among the upper class, were extremely important. So you had to be dressed appropriately. Excessive concern with appearance, especially among the middle class, so overdressing, following fashion too closely, spending too much money on new clothes and accessories was generally considered vulgar. This is a very Victorian word. Vulgar means the opposite of being a lady, really, or a gentleman. This is a person who does not behave the way they should. But the respect to the social rituals of dressing was absolutely essential. If you did not follow the etiquette of fashion, you could be ostracized socially, you would be left out when inviting people to dinners or other social occasions. If you were a man, your business credibility could suffer. You would not be treated seriously by your business partners. So this was really a serious thing. Even if you were poor, if you were a working class person, if you completely disregarded the etiquette of fashion, like you refused to wear black clothes after the death of a close relative, especially if you were a woman. So the so-called mourning rituals, mourning clothes. We'll talk about it later on, but this could really be devastating to the social interactions even of a poor person, a person who would notoriously go outside without some sort of headwear, without a hat or a bonnet. This was too vulgar even for very poor people. So everybody had to adhere to the rules of social etiquette to some extent. Of course, the more money you had and the more you cared about your respectability, as was the case with the middle class, there were more rules, they were more complex. Actually, these rules become more and more complex as the century progressed and certain elements of fashion became more affordable to the lower classes of the society. We don't really have time to talk about passing fads. We will not spend a lot of time in the coming weeks talking about passing fads, but rather the unspoken language of clothes, really, the symbolic meanings, the kind of messages that people wanted to convey through clothes. So before we start looking at the levels of formality of dress from women today, but they were very similar for other people, for men, for children. Let us now very quickly talk about why it happens in the 19th century. What really influenced the changes and the morality connected with clothes in the 19th century. So first of all, this is the century of rapid change. This is the century of fast progress, rapid expansion of the population, mass migration to the cities, the towns and cities, political reforms, the transmission of power from the landowners to the industrialists and the middle class, the belief in social progress, so the belief in a self-made man who is able to ascend the social scale. So we have the period of very rapid social change when traditional structure of the society was undermined, and it could react, people could react in two different, quite opposite ways. So there was a feeling of hope, of joy, but on the other hand, there was very often a fear of social disorder. This is all reflected in the manners. This is all reflected in the rules of social behavior and deportment, and also dress as part of that. So the fashion in clothes is really part of a bigger issue, because the language of manners became the means of distinguishing between social classes and recognizing outsiders. And you didn't want to be an outsider. So as I said, as the century progressed, there would be more and more complex rules. There was, of course, the growing popularity of ready-made clothes, but also the growing popularity of manuals of etiquette, the books with, let's say, rules of polite behavior, of good manners, and very often they included some information on clothes as well. The social life in the 19th century was becoming more complex. There were new popular leisure activities such as seaside holidays or sports. Every detail was important. In the end, every detail conveyed meaning, to the point that we don't really need to discuss. If you are very interested perhaps in a particular style or particular period of the 19th century, I strongly encourage you to go deeper and explore. Those video channels on YouTube are very good, and sometimes you get very detailed information about various aspects of clothing. So the choice of accessories, the material, the color, for men and women. For men, the complexity could go as far as, let's say, they needed to know the appropriate kind of shoes, the appropriate kind of collar or necktie or gloves or headwear that would be proper for the occasion, and if not, you could be ridiculed, at least, if not ostracized. So one of the most important requirements was that the dress should reflect the wearer's position in the society. So things like wealth, of course, but not only, marital status, age, social class, also sometimes occupation. So in the 19th century, this this is really a very class-conscious period, and people want to know their own position on the social ladder and other people's position on the social ladder, but the class structure is not clearly defined. So what happens is the informal system of status symbols, such as employing servants, engaging in appropriate leisure activities, eating appropriate foods, engaging in appropriate or kind of whatever you could afford sometimes, forms of entertaining, like inviting guests. How do you treat your guests? What attractions do you offer to them? If you invite them for dinner, how would the dinner be served? What kind of foods would be served for dinner? So all these luxuries, including clothes, of course, fashionable clothes, were treated much more seriously than fashion is nowadays. They were not a pleasurable luxury that some people can enjoy. They were a social necessity, needed to preserve the position in the world, or perhaps to try to improve your position in the world if you could. So just a little bit of general information of what do I mean by symbolic meaning of clothes in the 19th century. So for example, the obvious thing, wealth. Wealth has always been expressed through clothes. It was quite obvious. So most fashionable styles and the finest materials and the expensive ornaments, such as handmade lace or fur or jewelry, these were all indications of wealth. Also elaborate fashion that were quite uncomfortable. They restricted the movement, so they wouldn't be worn by anyone engaged in, let's say, physical labor of any kind, and they required help to put on, take off, and maintain. You may remember last week we talked a little bit about ladies' maids who were responsible for cleaning the ladies' clothes, but they were also responsible for helping the ladies to put on the clothes, to arrange the hair in a fashionable way. This is really the way to express the wealth, and not really a woman's wealth, but the wealth of her husband or the wealth of her family. The most important thing in Victorian culture, probably, but generally from the 19th century, from the beginning of the 19th century onwards, is that clothes should indicate gender relations in the society. Men's social role was to be professional, to earn money, especially in the middle class, where they had to work for their living, even if these were prestigious jobs, well-paid jobs. This means that men's clothing gradually became more sober. So it wasn't obvious really in the expression of wealth. You could see it through good craftsmanship, through better quality materials, through perhaps discreet use of accessories like a gold pocket watch, but not as much as you might recall from the 18th century, with wealth being the most important symbolic consideration. So both men and women would wear silks and embroidery and wigs and face powder and rouge and everything really they could afford to show their wealth. Now men's clothes are, let's say, increasingly sober in their outlook and increasingly uniform, professional. So dark suits, really, this is in the early years of the 19th century, in the Regency period. We'll talk about these periods next week, so if the word Regency doesn't tell you much, don't worry. For women, it was more obvious because women's role in the society in the 19th century was more decorative. There is a term, a theoretical term, from a theorist of culture called Thorstein Veblen. He came up with the term conspicuous consumption. Conspicuous consumption means spending money on a luxury to impress other people. Not really because you want to enjoy it. Not really because it's, adds to the comfort of life. No, you spend sometimes large amounts of money on luxurious things, not only clothes, any kind of luxuries, to impress other people and to mark your social position. So that's it. Another thing is gentility, the concept of a gentleman or a lady, which was developing in the 19th century. We'll probably talk about it some more when we talk about the Victorian fashions, because this is a very middle class concept. And by the time Queen Victoria comes to the throne, the middle class is really the dominant social force in the society. So being a gentleman or a lady was something different than being a noble person, than being an aristocrat. It wasn't really about birth, inheritance, and not so much about the money. The money was important, but it wasn't the most important thing. It was really about a way of life, a code of conduct, the moral code. You might think about a relatively poor person, or not necessarily a very rich person, who would still be considered a gentleman or a lady if they adhered closely to the norms of behavior. So courtesy, modesty, neatness, correct forms for each occasion, never being ostentatious, never being overdressed. Neatness and cleanliness especially were very important mark of gentility. You have to remember, Victorian cities were really very dirty. Everybody used a lot of coal, so there was a lot of dust everywhere, also in the homes of the Victorians. So having a clean house, having a daily bath, if you could, and having clean clothes was very important. That is why, for example, basically throughout the 19th century, you have a great emphasis in clothes for both sexes, but it's true for men and women, but more visible in women's clothes probably. The emphasis on white collars and white cuffs. So the parts next to the skin, next to the neck, next to the wrist, had to be white. Even if the entire dress was in different color, very often there would be like a little touch of white to indicate this dainty freshness. Sometimes, usually these would be detachable. Sometimes they would be part of the underwear, so let's say the cuffs would be part of the shirt, and the collars would be part of a chemisette, for example, or a corset cover. So parts of the underwear for men and women. But if you observe the fashion plates throughout the 19th century, more often than not, almost always, you will find a white collar of different style and white cuffs or undersleeves visible from beneath the sleeves. Another thing is smooth white hands delicate bone structure. So close-fitting gloves were very fashionable and very important, not only for practical reasons, but also for symbolic reasons. If you did not follow that, you would be declared vulgar. If your clothes were too dressy, if they were unproportional for the occasion, and it was especially bad, something we noticed last week, if the lower orders, that is the servants and the working class, tried to imitate the dress of their social superiors. Being dirty and untidy was an absolute catastrophe. The lack of money could be excused, but not being dirty and not decent and not wearing appropriate clothes. So this is really about respectability. Another thing, marital status expressed through clothes. The choice of colors, the choice of fabrics. Young unmarried ladies wanted to convey the image of someone useful, innocent and modest. Even if they came from a very rich family, this was really expected of them. Even if it did not really match their personality, if they wanted to play with fashion. No, they had to wait until they were married. Before they were married, to have a good position on the marriage market, they had to convey the impression that they are innocent, that they are modest, that they would be good hostesses. Light colors, delicate materials, simple trimming, not very expensive even if the family could afford it. No jewelry or very simple jewelry like a little gold chain rather than a big necklace, let's say. So modesty was believed generally to be attractive for a future husband, and that extravagance intimidates men. So no young lady wanted to be extravagant. The best moment in a woman's life was when she was young but already married. Then she could really enjoy all extremities of fashion if she could afford them and if she liked that. So darker, richer colors, more expensive fabrics, more dresses, more occasions, evening dresses. She would attend balls, of course, if the family's financial position allowed that. Jewelry and everything. This was really the best moment in her life. How long was a woman considered young? It really depends on the style, on the period in the 19th century. Earlier in the 19th century, normally a woman in her 30s was already considered middle-aged. So in the neoclassical fashion, in the romantic fashion, it starts to change a little in the Victorian fashion by the time that the tournure arrives, and especially in the Belle Epoque period, the length of youth, or at least perceived youth, was extended a lot. So much so that during the Belle Epoque, you could still be considered an attractive, beautiful woman who could just as well follow the fashion to the fullest until your 50s, really. So from the, let's say, late 20s at the latest, if you were married. If you were not married by 25, you were an old maid. But if you managed to be married, the period in which you could really enjoy the fashion to the fullest was until, let's say, 30 something, and in the last period of the 19th century, in the Edwardian period as well, up to 50 something, especially if you had a good figure. You could enjoy it. You could enjoy all kinds of darker, richer colors, lace, jewelry, colored stones rather than just white stones. So these things. Older women, however, especially widows, but generally older women, older than this limit, were advised to avoid the frivolities of fashion. So darker colors with delicate touches of lace, more economical. There was a very long tradition. There's something that really is visible in the first half of the 19th century. There was a very long tradition of married women to wear their heads covered indoors. They would not only wear a bonnet or a hat out of doors, they would also wear an indoor cap. And sometimes when they were going out of doors, they would put the bonnet on top of the indoor cap, which would create extra decoration. This was used by married women, however young they were, and also older women, even if they were spinsters. So this is really about the appropriateness. Then there were occasions, different occasions, mostly following the calendar of occasions used by the aristocracy. So the London season in the spring and early summer when Parliament was in session. This was the time when entire aristocratic families moved to London, and they would take part in all kinds of very formalized and stylish occasions. So a lot of new clothes would be seen then. But generally following the seasons of the year and following the times of day. And now I would like to move on to the highly illustrated part, in which we will talk about the 3 levels of formality, so the types of clothes that would really be dependent on the time of day. So we continue now.